Welcome to the Feds, insiders bringing accountability, integrity, and reform to a broken bureaucracy. At Feds for Freedom, we value constructive dissent and healthy debate. The views and opinions shared in today's episode are those of the speaker alone and do not express the views or opinions of the U.S. government or any other employer.
Welcome back to this week's episode of the Feds, where we seek truth. I am Stephanie Weidel. Before we begin, please go ahead and surf on over to Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, where you can hear the latest news from Feds for Freedom. Please like, comment, subscribe to, and share our podcasts. Feds for Freedom, in conjunction with the Virginia Medical Freedom Alliance, is hosting a conference at Liberty University on Saturday, April 5th in Lynchburg, Virginia. The title of the conference is Medical Freedom and the Constitution, Your Life in the Balance. Speakers include our own Carolyn Rocco, Jim Erdman, and Marcus Thornton. Also, Chrisana Shackelford, Vice Admiral Dean Lee, and Congressman Bob Good will be speaking alongside other fabulous speakers. We will be bringing our information about government overreach and how you can spot it and stand against it. Go ahead and visit the VAMFA website where you can register for this one-day event. And of course, visit our website and donate towards our mission at fedsforfreedom.org. This week, I am joined by Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, a psychiatrist and ethics professor who paid a heavy price for speaking out against the COVID narratives. He joined the lawsuit Missouri versus Biden to challenge the federal government's efforts to censor American speech. He has authored books and articles on a myriad of subjects, including public health, bioethics, psychiatry, and religion. Dr. Kheriaty, it's an honor to have you today.
Likewise, Stephanie. Good to be here.
You are an expert on a lot of topics, but today I wanted to start out talking about DOGE. What is your opinion about DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency?
So I like the concept. I think the administrative state and aspects of the administrative state that people often refer to as the deep state, the sort of permanent bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., has grown too large and too unwieldy. And most Americans do not know what their taxpayer dollars are going for. A simple example of this that I like to mention is I ask people, do you know how many three-letter federal agencies there are? How many could you name? The average well-informed American could maybe name a dozen, right? Okay, we have like the FBI, we have the CIA, and we have the public health agencies like the CDC and the FDA and the NIH. You know, you could probably rattle off a few more. And then I ask, how many in total are there? And most people don't realize that there are 434 federal agencies in the Federal Register, right? Most of which Americans could not name and have never heard of, and yet we're paying for them. And that's not to say that all those agencies are not doing good work. I'm sure within those 434 agencies, there's important stuff happening quietly, right? And they're accomplishing good things with our taxpayer dollars. But I also think that there is a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse. I think that more and more Americans are recognizing that there are redundancies and that there are just probably some things that are quite simply absurd and that most Americans wouldn't want to fund and wouldn't want to support. The USAID revelations recently, I think, are shining a spotlight on some of the soft power mechanisms that our foreign policy establishment uses to accomplish its goals abroad. And many of those things are, range from the distasteful to the absurd to the downright evil, right? And so some of this definitely has to be reined in. And the federal bureaucracy is so large that I think a surgical approach to this would quite literally be impossible, right? So to actually accomplish, put a meaningful dent in this and accomplish some meaningful reforms over the course of a 4-year, term, 4-year administration is probably going to require something of a wrecking ball approach. The downside of a wrecking ball approach is that you're using a wrecking ball, right? And probably a lot of good, hardworking, decent Americans that work for the federal government are going to find themselves out of work as a consequence of DOGE. And many of them may have been contributing in meaningful ways to the work of the federal government. And, they may find themselves out of a job. I don't see any other way to sort of avoid that outcome. I don't like that outcome, but at the same time, I think that reforms in this area are necessary. I think the American voters sent a clear message that they want this, because this was clearly part of the campaign for Trump and Vance. Trump had talked about tapping Elon Musk for this role as the head of Department of Government Efficiency while he was on the campaign trail. So Americans were aware of this, and they voted for it, in a very strong sort of election outcome. So I like what I'm seeing so far in terms of shining a spotlight on what's going on. And, perhaps some of the revelations have been exaggerated. Perhaps some of the revelations, there's a PR spin on them and they don't necessarily tell the whole story. So I can sympathize with people on the receiving end who say, well, no, wait a minute. Our whole department isn't doing, crazy, useless, wasteful things with your taxpayer dollars that, they may have pointed out the most egregious examples of these problems. That there's a lot of good that's happening here too. So I can sympathize with that. But at the same time, I think it's generally a good thing. Number one, that Americans are paying attention to this. Number two, that we're getting some transparency. And one of the things that's happening is that a lot of this information is available on publicly accessible government databases. It's just no one's ever bothered to look. So there's a lot of citizen researchers who can sit down at their computer now and just go through the databases and look at, let's look at the grants that this agency is giving. And let's look at what our own government database shows. And so, I think in the first few weeks of the administration, we're seeing a lot of the kind of, saucy, juicy, kind of headline grabbing revelations. But I'm hoping that with time, more careful research, people digging into this, what's really going on here with USAID? What's really going on here with this or that agency that's sort of under scrutiny or under fire? Let's separate the wheat from the chaff, and kind of come to a balanced assessment. I'm hoping that some of that more careful work can be done by investigative journalists or by sort of citizen journalists that operate on Twitter or on Substack. I think more people paying attention to what the federal government is doing is a good thing, right? That's citizen engagement with what are they spending our hard-earned taxpayer dollars on is a good thing.
Absolutely.
At the same time, I'm sympathetic to people who may be caught in the crosshairs of this and may find themselves out of a job when they actually have been, among the people that show up, in person and clock in and clock out and put in a hard day's work and actually accomplish something.
Yeah, I mean, our membership made up of primarily federal employees are definitely caught in the crosshairs. They're the ones that stood up to the federal government and said, you can't force me to take a EUA product. These are my constitutional rights, and they kept their jobs, and now they're on the chopping block. But most of them have a great attitude about it, saying, we are fighting for accountability and transparency, and this is a way to get it. The harder thing is not necessarily with what DOGE is doing, but how DOGE is doing it, because it's so swift. And is the question that some are asking, and even myself, because we've been trained to now question everything, especially when all of your eyes are on one thing and all American eyes are on what DOGE is doing. What else are we missing? Like, what are our eyes being taken away from? So thinking in that way, what do you think if that were a case here?
There's a phrase that floated around Silicon Valley a few years ago that a lot of these tech gurus like to, they would talk about creative destruction. That was a Silicon Valley meme. And I forget who it was, which company, but their unofficial model was move fast and break things. And that seems to be the DOGE approach to reforming the federal government, is to move fast and break things. And I think that's a deliberate political strategy to basically have so many revelations come so hard and so fast that the media can't keep up, and that the agencies that are going to want to entrench themselves and the bureaucrats that are going to want to entrench themselves and push back don't have time to keep up with what's going on. So that seems to be their political strategy. And I could see why they would take that tack when you don't have a friendly media, a media that's going to kick and scream every step of the way. with the legacy media, by and large, is not going to be sympathetic to what DOGE is doing. That their approach seems to be, well, let's just move as quickly as possible so that, tomorrow's news comes at you so fast and you're still stuck on yesterday's news that, you actually don't have time to keep up with everything we're doing. If you want to accomplish something in a large, unwieldy bureaucratic system with a lot of checks and balances built into it, I could see why they would take that political strategy. At the same time, you could see that strategy is going to probably create more collateral damage than a slow, careful, deliberative, let's have a lot of committee meetings, let's sort of study the problem, let's try to do this carefully and surgically. That approach probably would have less collateral damage. It probably also, at the end of the day, would accomplish a lot less. It would get bogged down in, let's nitpick and argue about, every new thing that we're introducing or every thing that we're going to cut because we consider it to be wasteful. So, I'm a little bit of two minds. I think what I would like to see probably after this initial phase of move fast and break things is, okay, let's let the dust settle and let's think about higher backs, right? So maybe we did away with this entire division or this entire department, and clearly, not everyone there deserves to lose their job, right? So let's invite them to, reapply for something and kind of wipe the slate clean, but then rebuild some of what we might have knocked down with our wrecking ball. And, that kind of approach might rebalance some of the scales of justice for some of those folks who maybe didn't deserve to lose their job.
Yeah, we reached out, Vets for Freedom reached out to DOGE on multiple occasions trying to get their attention, saying, hey, we have the lists of federal employees that actually broke the Constitution. Maybe start firing those people first.
Right.
But the wrecking ball, if they go with that approach, there's no carefully going through all of these investigative materials. So maybe that could be looked at the second stage, if the second stage actually happens of hiring back.
I anticipate it will, because there's going to be a retrenchment. This move fast and break things approach is going to have to slow down. Some federal judges have already intervened in the process here and there. There are checks and balances within our system. The president can't do anything and everything that he wants to do all at once. And so I think the approach will encounter that sooner or later, at which point, they're going to have to think about, okay, well, we did away with this thing, and now there's some things that we actually want to get done that they happen to be doing. So we need to maybe do some higher backs, or we maybe need to reopen this thing or reboot it or put it somewhere else and kind of, start it again on a smaller scale. It seems to me that something like that is probably that pendulum will swing in that direction at a certain point.
Do you think instead there might be the approach of let's use AI to fill these holes and let's increase our digital presence?
I think there certainly will be a push for that. It'll be pitched as a cost-saving device. It'll be pitched as maybe AI can do certain things better than human beings. And I think there are probably a small number of narrowly defined tasks, probably not full job descriptions, but aspects of someone's job description where AI might be helpful. It could be a useful tool. But AI cannot replace human judgment, human decision-making on complex problems. It simply can't. People look to it to try to do that at times, but it's not actually good at doing that.
AI might do a better job than some of the liberals out there.
Well, it depends on how it does what it's programmed to do. And it draws, it depends on the information it's drawing on. And it depends on what it does with that information. So it does give a few number of people that have access to that basically program the AI algorithm, gives them a lot of power. And it may look like this is sort of a neutral approach to decision making to make it more quote unquote objective. But in fact, the system itself is going to respond based on its programming. The rollout of Google's AI and the way in which it was hard slanted politically on certain issues is an obvious example that this is not a sort of neutral, objective arbiter of disinterested, information, but it does actually respond to the will of its creators. So, I mean, the example I use while we're on the topic of AI, because I'm a physician, and I've had two types of experiences with patients. I've had patients go to, let's say, ChatGPT or Grok and do a query saying, what are the risks and benefits of this antidepressant medication that I'm considering starting, or that I might have talked to my doctor about? And I think if ChatGPT draws on reputable sources of information, it could yield some valuable information about what are the risks and benefits of this medication. Although, again, that has to be contextualized, and you have to discuss that with your doctor. That worries me less than the patient, and I have had patients do this, query ChatGPT with the question, given my medical history, should I take this antidepressant medication? Now, trying to replace my physician's recommendation or the informed consent process, which Feds for Freedom are, all of you are going to be familiar with the ethics doctrine of informed consent, because this is where you put a stake in the ground in your own jobs. Trying to use AI as a repository of wisdom and how should I live my life, or how should I make decisions that impact me, I think is a bad idea. So using it as a source of information to inform my decision making, it can be a helpful tool in that regard, with some caveats and qualifications. Using it as a source of answers to difficult life questions, I think is very dangerous. Right. I think we hold it up as a sort of idol, as a sort of oracle of truth that's going to come back to bite us.
Do you think AI ever has a place to expand our freedoms, like on the freedom spectrum?
Yes.
I think, you could see it totally taking away freedoms, but would there ever be a place of it expanding our freedoms?
In the sense that, if I can use it as a time-saving device to help me accomplish tasks that I am still guiding and directing. If I'm trying to take 10,000 words and synthesize them into 1,000 words, a ChatGPT or large language model AI can be very useful for that. And that might help me, get my work done more quickly, right? But that's different than asking AI to write the paper for me, where I'm not actually doing the work. I'm not actually, it's this illusion of learning something. Let's say as a student, the illusion of learning something when I'm not actually learning something. I actually haven't mastered that body of knowledge. So it's very tricky. I think AI could enhance our freedoms, but it's seductive, and it's very easy for us to want to take shortcuts on the difficult process of, let's say, studying and learning as a student, or the difficult process of of complex decision making in my own personal life, or in my professional life, or in governance, right? So I do not want bots to govern me. I want human beings, as fallible and imperfect and messy as the whole political process is. I want to vote for somebody, and I want the person who got the most votes, however much I might like them or dislike them, I want them ultimately to be in charge of, let's say, making the laws under which I have to live. I do not want bots to do that, because I would just prefer to be ruled by human beings rather than by machines. And I think there is a temptation for many people to think that maybe machines can actually do this better. And that will spell the end of our system of self-governance and our system of representative democracy.
Since we're on the topic of technology, before we started recording, we were talking a lot about digital IDs and just increased technology by the government. again, all of our eyes are on DOGE. And the train of this digital age is not stopping no matter who is in power, Republican or Democrat. They're both going on this train track.
Yes.
And so where are we with digital IDs, digital currencies? Would you comment on that?
Yeah. So thank you for bringing this up. Let me just first say that I am not anti-technology. I use technology in my own life. I use digital technology all the time. We're recording this podcast using wonderful tools of digital technology. It will be distributed using those same tools. I am on Twitter, X. I'm an avid user of that social media platform. So technology has its uses. And, I'm not one who would advocate trying to turn back the clock on any of these things. But there are a few applications of digital technologies that I'm very, very concerned about. And you mentioned two of them. The first one is digital IDs, like the real ID that's going to be tied to biometric data. And by biometric data, I mean like a facial scan, an iris scan, a fingerprint. The clear system at the airport that you use to skip to the front of the lines would be an example of this use of digital technology that's tied into basically our bodies. And I'll explain in a few minutes why I'm concerned about digital IDs. The second piece of digital technology I'm very concerned about is central bank digital currencies, which should be distinguished from decentralized digital currencies like Bitcoin, which I think technologies like Bitcoin, blockchain technology could actually enhance our financial freedom. And but there's also uses of digital currencies that would be controlled by central banks. So a digital dollar, or China has already rolled out a digital yuan. There's other countries that have piloted central bank controlled digital currencies. So let's talk first about CBDCs. Let's suppose that the federal government gives you a $2,000 tax refund or tax credit in the form of a digital dollar in your digital wallet tied to your digital ID because you had a child, let's say. That sounds pretty good, right? $2,000. Well, unlike $2,000 cash or $2,000 in your bank account, this digital currency can be programmed by the federal government so that the government could restrict what you spend it on. Let's say the government wants to use this tax rebate to prime the pump of the economy. So they could say, well, you have to spend this in the next 9 months. We don't want you to save it. We don't want you to put it into retirement. We don't want you to stick it under your mattress and save it for later or invest it or whatever. We want you to spend it. And after 9 months, if you don't spend it, the value of that $2,000 is going to go down 10% every month until 20 months later, it disappears, right? The federal government could also say, you're only allowed to spend it on these approved businesses that have good ESG scores or good social credit, scores. And you're not allowed to spend it on these disfavored, industries. You have to spend it on green energy. You can't give it to charity, or you can only give it to these approved charities. You can't give it to those charities. So what you quickly realize is actually this is not something enhancing my freedom. This is not the same as a dollar in my pocket, right? It's a temporary voucher that the government has given me to try to control my financial behavior. Once it's tied to a digital ID, which makes it impossible for me to transfer it to someone else, and it makes it impossible for me to engage in financial transactions without using this digital currency, the government can also control me by means of controlling my financial behavior. So maybe I'm driving a gas guzzling car and they say, you need to switch over to a hybrid or an electric only vehicle sometime in the next year. And if you don't do that, then we're going to start, because you have to use your digital ID. Every time you buy gas, we're going to scan your retina to allow you to buy gas. We're going to double your gas tax, right? And, if after a year of that, you still haven't switched over and engaged in the kind of like behavior that we want you to engage in, then we're going to triple your gas tax. And at a certain point, if you don't fall in line and, buy a new electric only vehicle, we're just going to turn off your ability to buy gas, right? So you can totally control people using these two mechanisms through basically boxing them out of their ability to engage in financial transactions. I mean, imagine a cashless society where vendors are forced to transact only using a central bank digital currency. And, you have to do your own transactions because everything is tied to your fingerprint and your iris scan or your face ID or whatever. You have a society in which anyone who controls that data and anyone who controls the mechanisms of financial currency has total control over the population and over that population's movements, over their behaviors, over their ability to basically buy and sell and live life. So these are potential mechanisms of totalitarian control, the likes of which the world has never seen. They're not going to be sold to us as such. They're going to be sold to us based on convenience, based on, frictionless ease. And, you forgot your passport at home and you're about to miss your flight. Well, we'll just do an iris scan and wave you through, right? How convenient. Wonderful. I never have to carry my driver's license in my pocket anymore. Sounds, it sounds useful. It sounds like it's something that enhances my freedom. Whereas in fact, it basically allows for complete surveillance and complete control of the entire population.
It sounds absolutely scary to me. So real IDs are still on their way in. Like that has not changed. There was kind of a halt to it during COVID, but we're back on the track to getting those real IDs. Fortunately, I have not gotten mine yet, and I do not plan to get one.
Yep, I'll carry my passport to the airport after they mandate the real ID. Oh, the other thing, speaking of airports, is that the TSA security screening that's now using face IDs. They are not taking your picture; they're scanning your face in the same way your iPhone might scan your face as a security measure. And you can opt out of that if you read the fine print on the TSA website. You can opt out of that and hand them your driver's license or your passport, and they are required under law to wave you through. And I think we should opt out of that. I think the idea basically of total surveillance through facial scans, through retinal scans, through fingerprinting everywhere you go, just to access basic public goods and services is not a trend that Americans should passively accept. Again, it's going to be sold on the basis of convenience, but if you peel back the carpet and look underneath, what you see is actually this trend is very dangerous, I think.
Right. Well, going back to CBDCs, didn't Trump say that he was not going to be going for that?
He did. I think he has basically come out and said, we're not going to do CBDCs because there has been some public pushback against those. I think there's been less public pushback against digital IDs. There's been less public pushback against the surveillance and the closed caption TV cameras that are popping up everywhere in all of our major cities. And I think that's something that I'm trying to raise awareness on, because people need to realize that the use of technology to build a basically system of total surveillance is currently being rolled out. And as you said, being supported more or less by technocrats in both of the parties. I mean, the third and last thing I'll say about this is the push will also involve more and more data that's being extracted basically from our bodies. So Yuval Harari, the basically resident philosopher of the World Economic Forum, keeps talking about human beings basically being biological algorithms and quote unquote hackable animals, and that the next step in surveillance involves surveillance going underneath our skin. What does he mean by that? He means wearable devices or implantable devices that monitor moment to moment our heart rate, blood pressure, skin conductance. And again, it's going to be sold on the basis of monitoring our health, right? If you have a health condition, this can pick up on, if something's going on with your heart and it'll send an alert to your phone so that I need to go get an EKG or I need to go get checked out at the doctor. It's going to be sold on the basis of, the way that these wearable devices are sold on the basis of health monitoring, right? But in fact, what they're doing is going down a deeper level, a deeper layer of total surveillance where people already worry rightly about this device listening to them all the time, right? I had a conversation, or I just had this podcast. We talked about we talked about this theme, and then I go on and I do a Google search, and the ads suddenly pick up on what I was just saying. Even if my phone was powered down, it's still listening to me. And I think people are right to worry about that. These have become listening devices, and basically your data is being extracted all the time, whether you're using the device or not. It's packaged up and it's sold to the highest bidder. Well, what does surveillance of their skin involve? Imagine watching a presidential debate with a wearable device or an implantable device that's monitoring your heart rate, your blood pressure, your skin conductance. While you're watching this debate, even if you don't say anything that your phone picks up on, whoever has access to that data knows your exact emotional response to everything that's being discussed in that presidential debate, moment to moment. So they basically have access to what you're thinking and feeling about both of the candidates or about any of the issues that are discussed. That's the level of surveillance that this next step will involve. So I think we need to wake up to the fact that these things that are being sold on the basis of convenience or self-monitoring, actually that data is being used and can be used for all kinds of other purposes. Some of them perhaps more benign and some of them potentially much more nefarious.
Aaron, this is downright frightening. How close are we to getting to that surveillance state of our inside our body?
Yeah, so the technology is all already there. My last book was called The New Abnormal, which a quick glance at the book makes it look like a book primarily about COVID. It's not primarily about COVID. It's about these types of technologies that were rolled out and advanced during the COVID crisis, right, under the guise of the state of emergency. And basically, the book tries to look to the future. What is the next step on these things? And the epilogue, the last chapter of the book is nonfiction, but the last chapter is called Seattle 2030. And it's a fictional short story trying to imagine what the world in the not too distant future might look like. And basically, the premise of Seattle 2030 is take already existing technologies and just imagine a world in which they're adopted on a mass scale. And what would that world look like, right? And so, shameless plug for my book, but take a look at that epilogue in the book if you want to understand what this world will look like. And basically what I said is I'm not going to invent any new technologies to describe what the world might look like 5-6 years from now. I'm going to take already existing technologies and just imagine what the world would look like if they're rolled out on a mass scale. And everything we've discussed so far relies on already existing technologies. There's simply technologies that are in the process of being adopted on a widespread scale, or that are in the process of, they're going to be rolled out soon with a pitch to help us adopt them on a widespread scale. So nothing that I've described relies on futuristic technology that hasn't been developed yet. It's stuff that's here. Much of it is already being used in this way. We haven't even noticed. It sort of happened quietly at the airports or with the devices, or, that the Face ID thing, kids are being conditioned to use this. A lot of public schools use Face IDs to move kids through the school lunch line more quickly and to help them engage in their transactions. They're not having to swipe their badge or, pay for their food using cash or whatever. So people are getting used to this idea of my body as an instrument to be used in social and financial transactions. And we're conditioning them at a very, very young age to get used to this. And again, all of this is also extracting data from us at the same time on our whereabouts, on our movements, on our preferences, on our purchases. And we've by and large accepted this and it's been happening for, since the invention of the iPhone in 2007, essentially. So it's been happening for almost, a couple of decades now. And I think, it's time for people to start waking up and asking, do I want to live in a society in which basically I'm being surveilled and tracked all the time?
That's my next question. How can liberty-minded American citizens actually stand up against this? How can they push back?
So I think we need to opt out of the TSA screenings, some practical things. if even a small but vocal minority of people opt out of that, 5, 10, 15% of people, the federal government will be very reluctant to mandate it. The reason they'll be reluctant is that they don't want public controversy. They don't want a handful of federal employees. They don't want a few high-profile celebrities saying, no, I don't like this, and here's why. They don't want a public debate or a public conversation about this. They want everything to be done quietly without people noticing. So, you might think, well, most people are not opting out of this. Why should I bother? Well, a small but vocal minority, 8, 10% of people is enough very often to stop this sort of thing from being rolled out, because those who are doing it don't want a public debate. That's the last thing that they want. The last thing they want is for this to become an issue people are talking about on social media or talking about on the evening news. So opting out of TSA screenings, rejecting digital IDs, use your passport, use your paper ID. Definitely pushing back if the federal government makes another run at central bank digital currencies, make an issue out of that. And then, do some basic things to secure your devices. VPNs can help protect some of your data on your personal computer. There are dumb phones, so-called, that are being developed that I think are much more secure and less data extractive. There are settings on your phone that, some of the phone companies are paying more attention to privacy now. And, depending on how you set things up, you can enhance your privacy. So I think there are some basic steps like that people can begin to take. And again, it doesn't require a majority of the population to start doing this. If a small but vocal minority of 10, 15% of people start doing this, the market will respond. The private actors involved in developing mobile phones will respond to concerns about privacy from their consumers, right? Apple and Google don't want to take a 15% hit to their mobile phone, their smartphone market, right? So these things will make a difference. But I think the step one is share this kind of information with, your family and friends, because just people need to be aware of what's happening. Most people aren't aware of the problems with digital IDs. Most people haven't heard of central bank digital currencies. Most people think their photograph is being taken at the TSA checkpoint. No, this is not about taking a photograph. This is about scanning your face and putting that into a government database that the NSA and the other intelligence agencies maintain so that they can track your every movement all over the country, wherever you go.
This is excellent, Aaron. How would you respond to someone who said, look, DOGE is being really transparent. Our current administration is trying to make the government more transparent. What do you mean that they don't want to have this conversation publicly?
So, first of all, I think most of the push for this is coming from the intelligence agencies, and they have never been transparent, and they will never be transparent.
Yep.
So I mean, that's the first thing that I will say. And the most resistance that you're going to see to any efforts at reform, whether it's DOGE or any other efforts by the current or future administration, is going to come from the intelligence agencies. They'll basically say, we're just going to classify everything. And, you don't have access to classified information, or very few people have access to classified information. So that's a huge problem that has not been tackled yet. I mean, I think Trump has talked about releasing the RFK, JFK, Martin Luther King Jr. assassination files after 60 years. That's well overdue, 50 whatever years later. So that's a start, but I mean, that's tip of the iceberg in terms of reining in what I take to be pretty out of control intelligence agencies. So yeah, there's a lot of talk about government transparency, but we still haven't seen any. I don't anticipate we're going to see much transparency from the military and intelligence apparatus that is basically grown to unwieldy proportions and is now turning the techniques that were supposed to be used against foreign adversaries, turning those inward to surveil its own population, which to me is completely unconstitutional and wrong.
Absolutely.
But they're still doing it.
Yes. So how can Trump, an administration who said we want transparency and accountability within the government, or he's kind of said that, How could he rein in something like this? I mean, this is a beast that is uniparty. How do you deal with this?
It's a very, very hard problem. There were some efforts back in the 1970s. There was a congressional committee called the Church Committee. Had nothing to do with churches. The congressman's last name was Church, who chaired it. And they tried to rein in the intelligence agencies, and there was some spotlighting of what the CIA was up to, and then, nefarious things they were doing abroad. And they reined that in a little bit, but it very quickly kind of rebooted and got geared up. And, they were back to the same old sort of Department of Dirty Tricks before long. And we haven't had anything, again, in the last 50 years to really scrutinize the CIA or the NSA, the other intelligence services. And really what it's going to take is Congress developing a spine and not being so afraid of the intelligence community, who probably has blackmail information on every member of Congress, because Congress holds the ultimate power, which is the power of the purse strings, right? So until Congress basically says, no, we're not going to send you funding for your black box projects that nobody can know, what's going on here, and the American people don't know what you're doing. We're not going to fund this anymore. Until that happens, nothing is going to change. The president alone, I think, cannot reform the intelligence agencies. His administration alone cannot reform the intelligence agencies. The only power that we really have over these agencies is to stop sending them taxpayer money, basically. And so far, Congress has not been willing to do that, to take a hard stance and actually say, no, we're gonna slash your budget, and then you're gonna have to fire people because you won't be able to pay their salaries unless you come in and cooperate. And, Congress is not going to do that until the American people demand it, until the American people start voting people out of office because they refuse to do that. So ultimately, that political push is going to have to come because Congress is more scared of voters than they are of CIA spooks. And right now, I don't see a movement in that direction among voters.
Yeah, I don't see it either. It's Congress growing a spine, but it's the American people growing a spine.
That's right.
That's the root of it.
That's right. Congress is going to be responsible to their voters. And if they're afraid that if I don't do this, that they're going to vote in someone else who's claiming that they will do this, then they'll act. And until that happens, we're going to have more of the same.
Americans growing spines. We're going to talk about censorship. You had a spine and you were completely squished. Would you just briefly talk about how your life was impacted by censorship?
Sure. So, let me start with the vaccine mandates. That will segue into the issue of censorship because, Feds for Freedom, obviously this is an issue that many of you cared about and stood strong on. So I did end up losing my job over vaccine mandates. I was a professor in the School of Medicine at the University of California, Irvine. I had been there for 16 years, 20 years if you count my residency training there. And about half my time there was spent also doing work in medical ethics. So I was the director of the medical ethics program at UCI, and I worked with the entire UC system, all 5 of our hospitals, developing COVID policies up until the vaccine mandate policy, which our committee did not vet, which came down from on high. And I was very concerned that, of all the policies that we developed during the pandemic, this is going to be the most ethically controversial. So why weren't we consulted on this policy? And so that bothered me. So I published a piece in the Wall Street Journal arguing that university vaccine mandates were unethical, trying to get a conversation going at the university about the proposed vaccine mandate before it was finalized. That went nowhere. And so once the mandate was finalized, I decided that I didn't want to sort of take it lying down. And so I filed a lawsuit in federal court challenging the university's vaccine mandate, which I didn't end up winning. I think some of that was a timing issue. There's now a Ninth Circuit court precedent that came a couple of years after my lawsuit, under which I probably would have prevailed in my lawsuit. But at the time, none of the judges were willing to take a hard look at the question of vaccine mandates and the legality of vaccine mandates. So I ended up losing that case, and the university actually shortly after I filed the case, even before the judge made a final ruling in the case, the university fired me. So, if you want to go sideways with your employer very, very quickly, a good way to do that is to sue them in federal court. So that's what happened to me. And then after I got fired, I started also noticing that you couldn't have a conversation about vaccine mandates, and you couldn't have a conversation about the wisdom of prolonged lockdowns and school closures, or many of mask mandates, many of our other COVID policies on social media. So I was citing peer-reviewed medical literature and getting posts taken down, as were many of my colleagues, and some of us actually getting kicked off social media platforms. So that bothered us. But at the time, we thought that these are private actors. This is Facebook, this is Twitter that's doing the censorship. And what we came to learn, largely through the president's press secretary, Jen Psaki, getting up and bragging about working with social media companies to take down so-called misinformation about COVID policies, was that the federal government was actually pressuring social media companies to do this. And, we can have an argument about whether the private actors should be able to censor or not. There's interesting legal questions around that. But nobody doubts, and there's really no controversy, that the federal government cannot engage in censorship of constitutionally protected speech. So with the state of Louisiana and Missouri, the state attorney generals of those two states, along with 5 private plaintiffs, we filed a lawsuit called Missouri v. Biden, also known, parts of the lawsuit have been known as Murthy v. Missouri. That was the aspect that was at the Supreme Court about a year ago, basically alleging that the federal government has been engaged in unconstitutional censorship by forcing, coercing, pressuring, cajoling social media companies to do its bidding. Right around the time we filed that case, that was me, Jay Bhattacharya, who's now been tapped as the next NIH director, Martin Koldor, formerly of Harvard University, Joe Hines, who's a health freedom advocate, and Jim Hoff, who's a journalist. We were the 5 private plaintiffs in that case. That case is still in federal court, still being litigated. The government's now arguing that the case is moot based on a recent executive order from the new administration that Trump signed on his first day in office, basically dismantling the government censorship apparatus. So we'll see what the court does, whether they're going to issue a ruling in our case or whether they're going to basically say, no, the government's taking care of this issue, and so the case is moot. But the case did have the merit of shining a spotlight on the issue and drawing attention to the issue. So we have 20,000 pages of documents on discovery that we've written about and published about. We've done half a dozen depositions of key government officials, including Anthony Fauci. That was the first time Fauci had to answer difficult questions about the pandemic under oath, under penalty of perjury. So that was a fun process, deposing Fauci for this case. And around the same time, Elon Musk bought Twitter and opened up some of the back channels of Twitter communications to a handful of independent journalists who published the so-called Twitter files. So the Twitter files basically confirmed what we found in Missouri v. Biden, that yes, indeed, the government was engaged in unconstitutional censorship on a massive scale. And in fact, the district court judge who issued the original preliminary injunction against the government said in his ruling that if what plaintiffs allege is true, this is arguably the worst free speech violation in United States history. That was not one of the plaintiffs who said that. That was not one of our lawyers who said that. That was a federal judge looking at the evidence that we had submitted to the court and saying, this is Orwellian machinery that's been at work that impacted potentially hundreds of thousands of ordinary Americans on social media tens of millions of times. When the government pressured Facebook and other companies to actually change their algorithms to basically affect the kind of censorship that the government wanted, that had enormous impacts on everyday Americans who were just trying to share information online. So Missouri v. Biden, I think, succeeded so far in shedding light on this issue and making it an issue in the presidential election. J.D. Vance, the last question he was asked during his vice presidential debate, said the greatest threat to democracy is actually the government censorship that's been happening on an industrial scale for the last several years. So direct allusion to what our case had uncovered. And then we saw the executive order on day one of office, basically the new administration prioritizing, um, uh, free speech. And I like to tell people, regardless of whether you're happy or upset about the results of the recent election, the censorship issue, even though the case is called Missouri v. Biden, we always argued, and the plaintiffs actually are a mix of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. We're not all right-wing Trump supporters. This, for us, is not a left versus right. It's not a Democrat versus Republican issue. This is a constitutional issue. I don't want the previous administration. I don't want the current administration. I don't want the next administration, whoever they are, to have access to this kind of power, to be able to control the flow of information online, to control what Americans can and cannot say online. Free speech is absolutely essential to our constitutional order and to the basic civil liberties of all Americans. It's essential for science and medicine. Science and censorship are completely incompatible. Science advances precisely by challenging what people think they already know, by challenging, the consensus. By everyone knows that the Earth goes around, or that the sun goes around the Earth, right? Obviously, you can look up with your own eyes and see that, and then somebody comes along and says, "No, hey, wait a minute, I'm going to challenge what we think we know," and that's actually how you advance science. It's actually how you advance medicine. It's actually how you make advances and breakthroughs in technology. So a free society cannot coexist with censorship, and also good science and medicine cannot coexist with censorship. And so censorship is extremely dangerous. And I sort of fell into this issue by accident. 3 or 4 years ago, I never would have imagined spending so much of my time learning about the First Amendment and free speech and government censorship, and yet I have come to appreciate being on the receiving end of the censorship, come to appreciate just how important this is and why our founders put it as one of the very first freedoms enumerated in the Constitution.
Yes, that's a good point. Now, you were speaking up about the COVID mandates, you were the vaccine mandates, but also, you're a psychiatrist. You were talking about the lockdowns, and our society has had issues with social isolation even before COVID happened, but this exacerbated the problem. So what are your thoughts on the lasting impact of social isolation, and how do we get out of this?
Yeah, thank you for asking about this. Before I challenged vaccine mandates in 2021 and lost my job the end of that year over that issue, in 2020, prior to the vaccines, prior to the mandates, when we were in this phase of prolonged lockdowns and school closures, the very first thing I published that was critical of the mainstream widely adopted COVID policies was an article in Public Discourse called The Other Pandemic. And it was about the lockdown mental health crisis. It was about the mental health crisis among young people that I was seeing with my own eyes clinically. And that summer, we started getting research, including research from our own CDC that nobody was talking about, nobody was paying attention to, showing that basically the lockdowns were having massive collateral harms on mental health. And prior to COVID, from 1999 to 2019, we had a 2 decades long increase in so-called deaths of despair. 2 Nobel Prize winning economists at Princeton, Case and Deaton, had written about this prior to the pandemic. Deaths of despair being deaths by suicide, alcohol-related illness, and drug overdose. And so we had a very serious problem. In 1999, there were 20,000 drug overdoses in the country, which is tragic. By 2019, prior to the pandemic, that number had increased to 70,000. And then just a year later, after a year of prolonged lockdowns, that 70,000 number leapt to 100,000 deaths by drug overdose. Alcohol-related deaths did exactly the same thing, went from 69,000 to 99,000 in a single year. And nobody was talking about those folks. Nobody was talking about those as we were exclusively focused on COVID-related deaths, COVID-related morbidity and mortality. We were ignoring everything else. I thought that's a very serious problem because we already had a mental health crisis in the United States. We already had seen for 2 decades an increase in the tragedy of suicide. in basically every age category except for the very elderly. So over the age of 75 had seen a slight drop in suicide. Everyone else, men and women, had seen a sharp increase in suicidality. We basically poured gasoline on that fire with prolonged lockdowns and school closures and made an already bad problem even worse. The worst moment of COVID for me was the loss of a young man by suicide, basically the best friend of one of my children growing up, a kid that I literally had known since he was born. At the age of 17, took his own life in December of 2020. That was the low point for me of COVID. And he was just one among many tragic deaths that, again, nobody was talking about during the pandemic. And so as we take stock of kind of what happened to us during that period of time, as we take stock of some of the, what I take to be deeply misguided policies that we enacted without heed to the consequences, I think we need a serious reckoning on this mental health crisis. You mentioned the issue of loneliness. So what was driving deaths of despair even prior to COVID? Loneliness. So back in the 1980s, if you polled Americans and asked them, do you have someone in your life with whom you can discuss important matters? Which is a pretty good proxy for loneliness. Do you have a family member, a friend, a close colleague at work that if you're dealing with some personal difficulty, you can have a meaningful conversation with them about it? Back in the 1980s, 20% of Americans said, no, I don't have anyone like that. 1 in 5 Americans would, if that's a proxy for loneliness, would qualify. That number today has doubled. 4 in 10 Americans, 40%, say they have no one in their life with whom they can discuss important matters. What did we do during COVID? We isolated people. We forced them to stop face-to-face interactions. This model of social distancing basically took a loneliness epidemic, which Surgeon General Vivek Murthy was Surgeon General under Obama and again under Biden in 2018, called loneliness a serious public health epidemic, the negative impact of which is comparable to smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day, right? And you can look at the effects on medical illnesses from heart disease and cancer and obesity and other problems. You can look at the mental health effects of loneliness and see that this actually has a very serious negative impact on our health. Human beings are not built to live in isolation, right? We're hardwired to connect with one another. What's one of the most severe punishments you can inflict on another human being? Solitary confinement. After a few short months in solitary, people start hallucinating. Their mental faculties literally start coming apart because we're not designed to exist in isolation from other people. We're also not designed to have all of our communications exclusively digital. It's not actually the same. Doesn't have the same effects on our brain, doesn't have the same effects on our physiology as when we have a face-to-face encounter with a person where the senses are engaged. The tactile nature of those encounters is very, very different than digital encounters. So this is another serious societal issue, I would say, that has all kinds of social consequences aside from health. But just looking at it through the lens of public health, there's a very serious loneliness epidemic in the United States that we need to start contending with and pushing back on. And this push to, again, accelerated during the pandemic, to have all of our interactions, all of our work being done using digital technology. I think there's a downside to that people need to be aware of, that staring at a screen all day is actually not conducive to health and human flourishing.
Yes, that's a very good point. I had one question before I ask my final question. We know that women are people of relationship. We like to talk with people and, share stories, share our lives. The cases of those people who were saying, I don't have anyone to share my life with, to share my stories with. Were those mostly men or was it pretty split evenly?
So the numbers I've seen are not mostly men. Sadly, they're pretty split evenly among men and women. So this is a crisis not just affecting men. The largest jump in suicide that we've seen in the last several years has been among adolescent girls, sad to say. 10 to 14-year-old girls, the rate of suicide has tripled. When I was in residency training just 20 years ago, conventional wisdom was suicide prior to puberty was like non-existent and exceptionally rare. And now, unfortunately, it's not non-existent. So even children prior to puberty are at significant risk of suicide that we didn't see in our culture 20 years ago. So something is happening, I think, mostly in the realm of social relationships. There's other factors that are contributing as well, economic challenges and other things. I don't want to pin it all on digital technology. I don't want to pin it all on this issue of loneliness. There's family breakdown. There's all kinds of other things that are playing a role here. But certainly the diminishing of face-to-face encounters that we were already seeing, because of just new social developments and new trends professionally, accelerated in a very, very serious way during COVID. And now I think we're seeing the effects of that, and we'll be seeing the effects of that probably for decades. I mean, you just can't rob children of critical years of education and social development as adolescents or young adults and not actually see the negative impact of that playing out over the course of the next several decades. It's not something that we're going to be able to fix, next year. Sad to say.
Right.
I wish it was.
I have to add to that. I know that environmental toxins, also toxins being injected into young people, will create neurological differences. Then they will be evaluated. Then they will be sent to the mental health professionals. Then they will be given antidepressants. Then they will have worse depression or suicidal thoughts as a result of long-term use of those drugs. So it's like isolation plus all of this like epidemic of like these mental health diagnoses that are only treated with drugs. I mean, it's just this explosion during this time. And I know this because I've seen it firsthand.
Yeah, no, this goes to the sort of chronic disease epidemic that the Make America Healthy Again movement, RFK Jr.'s trying to draw attention to. And certainly there's a mental health aspect of that can't be ignored. Antidepressants and other psychotropic medications have their place. I do prescribe them. If they're used judiciously, they can be helpful and even life-saving, but they're not the answer to all of these problems. Just like, more Ozempic is not going to, solve our obesity and metabolic syndrome crisis. Just getting everyone, the entire population, putting antidepressants in the water is not going to solve this mental health crisis. Used carefully and judiciously for certain people, they can be a piece of the recovery process, but certainly a holistic approach to mental health care, including, as you mentioned, taking a look at the environmental toxins, the food, the other things that are slowly but surely seem to be poisoning us. That's going to be absolutely necessary. A pharmaceutical solution to this, if our only tool is a hammer, that's actually not going to be helpful.
Agreed. Well, if the average American citizen could do one thing to combat isolation, to stand against corruption, to do all of this, what would it be? They could do one thing.
So I would say start by looking at your use of digital technologies. You could switch from a smartphone to a so-called dumb phone, the Wise phone, the Bark phone, the Light phone. There's new models on the market. Doing a social media fast, for like I'm going to do one during Lent, right? I did one during Advent leading up to Christmas just to kind of take a break from Twitter for a month. So doing certain positive things to connect with people is important, but also removing some of the obstacles. For most people, that's going to be the excessive use of this device can also be helpful, right? So just putting certain restrictions on, rather than texting this person, I'm going to pick up the phone and call them. Maybe rather than calling them, if they're in a cubicle down the hall, I'm going to stand up and walk down there and knock on their door and have a face-to-face, conversation with them rather than sending a text message when they're 200 feet away. So being intentional and deliberate about this and, trying a few things, I threw out a few ideas, but there's many others that you could come up with, right? So digital technology allows us to connect to people that are far away and, have Zoom chats and other things that I'm sure it facilitates the work of Feds for Freedom, because you guys may be spread out all over the place. Not all of you, perhaps, in the DC area. But also, maybe I need to start a book club with my friends and read books that are printed on paper and have face-to-face conversations with them once a month, right? That's a simple thing that I can do that will have so many benefits intellectually, socially, for my mental health, for my relationships, for my friendships. But I think if we just kind of passively continue to float downstream with the current drift and direction of the culture, we're not going to make headway on this. It's going to require small groups, families, communities saying, we're going to make an effort to push back against that. I mean, I know families that do tech-free Sundays, right? And all of the devices go in a basket all day long, once a week. And, we just have a screen-free day where we're hanging out together, we're talking, we're playing family games, we're going and doing an activity together. That's a simple thing that a family could implement, for example, to try to swim against the current a little bit and reclaim some of our freedom and some of our mind space from these devices. We've all kind of become cyborgs. And even if these things are not implanted in our bodies quite yet, they might as well be, right? If we start going through withdrawals, tech-free Sunday, and my mind keeps going to where's my phone, and, I need to check this, or I need to text that, or I need to look up this other thing. We've probably allowed these things to reshape us, reshape our brains, reshape our bodies, reshape our relationships, without even realizing that it was happening in very, very profound ways. And so a detox period to help us move away from that, I think, can be powerful. You can learn a lot about yourself in the process. You could be the smoker who said I could quit anytime. I just don't want to, right? Oh, well, try for a week, actually see what happens. Yeah, I don't need my phone. I'm not, I could quit anytime. Okay, well, try it for a week, or, try it for a month, or at least delete some of the high use apps for a period of time and see what happens. I think that could be very instructive for people, just in terms of self-knowledge and kind of being honest with ourselves about what we've maybe passively allowed to take over in sort of thoughtlessly, and then saying, okay, well, maybe there's a better way to engage with this without necessarily throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And most people can't professionally do away with their devices entirely, but how could I sort of reshape my interaction with this technology in a way that it serves my purpose and I don't become a slave to it?
That's exactly right. I am totally going to implement that in my home. We're going to have a tech-free, put it in your basket Sunday. So thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was such a pleasure. I mean, what an honor to have you on.
Thanks, Stephanie. I enjoyed the conversation very much.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Please like, comment, subscribe to, and share these podcasts. I'll see you next week.